right, so here we are. And I think I pointed out when I was showing you my mix template that I have some tracks that are labeled samples. Kick 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And I actually have some files in here that are, when the tracks are imported, these files are imported as well. So the way I do drum samples is a little different than I think a lot of people do it. You know, there's a few program applications out there or plugins like Trigger and Drumagog, and Sound Replacer was one. I don't know if they still make that, but all those are, are cool. They have their place. I think that they've probably come a long way. The way I like to do it, and I've learned this, I'm not the one who invented this technique, but learned it along the way. What I'll do is I'll create like a little file right here, and I'm just going to consolidate an empty track, right? To create a little audio file here, I'm going to name it Sliver, because I just call it Sliver. I've already have that, so I'll just name it Sliver with a little underscore, right? Where'd you go? Right there. I'm going to cut it, so now it's in my clipboard, right? And I'm going to take this Sliver track and I'm going to put it right above my my kick input. And I'm going to group those together, and I'm just with a group called temp. And what this allows me to do, if you pay attention, I'm going to solo up this kick drum, is now I have a group with my kick sliver track and my kick in track. And I'm going to use the feature called tab to transient, which is right up here. And I'm going to just paste this sliver along on every kick drum, right? So we're cruising along. You got to get it right up to there. It's kind of like doing it by hand. For a long time, Drumagog, for many years, Drumagog and Slate's Trigger did not exist. And this was the only way to add samples. Back in the tape days, what you would do is you would take your snare track and you'd put it so it was playing back off the sync head. So it was actually playing your snare track back early, and then you would feed that into like a Elise's D4 or some sort of MIDI trigger, and then run that through a delay unit to get it into sync. And it sounded okay, wasn't real accurate, would flam a little bit here and there. This way I find actually very accurate. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to activate these so we can see them, is I have this little guy here. I'll drag that up here so I have it all on the screen. And this is one of the kick samples. I'll highlight it. And I see it up there. And I hold down a Shift and Command, click on it, and when you see it go across this yellow little sliver, you get this little thing. And this is a function called Replace Clip. It used to be called Region Replace. All instances of original clip, and now it's dropped that in. Now, I just do them one at a time. To do a kick, it depends on how complicated the track is, but to do a kick and snare sample and then fly in the samples using the clip replace function built into Pro Tools, it's in there, so you don't need to buy any extra plugins. Works really well. And I'm going to open up a session that has it completed so I can play you what it sounds like. Okay, so now I just opened up a session where I've completed it. So the slivers are, as you can see, are throughout the whole song. Here's the ones for the kick. Here's the ones for the snares. And what this gives me that I like is now, rather than having to open up a plugin, I have all my samples that I like are right here on a fader. So if I solo up my kick drum, and so then what I've come up with here is now I have this. That. Probably don't need that. This third one I decided I didn't like. And that's the one right there. So that's pretty good kick sound. Now let's hear our snare. And I think we're into the chorus coming up here. That's our snare. With that. Or that. So I actually like both of these. That one there. And I have all my samples are on a VCA, so that way when I'm getting my overall snare drum sound, and I got all my samples in, I could just decide to turn the snare up or down, the sample up or down. If I decide that over a drum fill it sounds too machine-like, I can go in and I can just draw a little bit of automation right there on the VCA, and it'll turn all the samples down. It's really just about the backbeat that I want. I want the backbeat to be carved out. So let's hear what this sounds like.
Take off, show me the stars. I'm ready to leave.
Then add the sample in.
I'm ready to leave the city. I'm flat broke. Show me the road to the good life, the good life, the good life.
And the other thing you can do.
Take off, show me the stars. Away from the lights, away from the lights in the city. I'm flat broke.
You want to add more top end to your snare. If you do it with this, if you do it with the sample, you're not adding cymbal hash. Sometimes I'll actually grab a snare drum from the track that I'm working on, and I'll add that into the samples as well. So that way it's more natural. It's more the sound that's in the room mics, but I can still have EQ and compression control without pulling up a bunch of room sound. So that's a quick little tutorial on how I do my drum samples. Here's my kick. Here's my kick and snare. So I'm riding that sample a little loud. I'll tuck it in a little bit. Okay. Add some overhead. Now, a lot of what I'm doing here is kick and snare. Go into this parallel compressor here. I'm going to turn it up a little too loud so you can hear it. So when you turn it up too loud, it sounds a little baked and silly, but underneath the track, you got this. So you're making it sound like the kick and snare louder without actually making the kick and snare louder. And now I seem to be digging some of this stressor as well, but usually the 1176 is sort of like the leading one. Now that little drum sample went by, sounded a little funny and a little fake, but in the mix, it'll be cool. I think it'll be cool. I'm using a little bit of RMX16 on the snare drum just to add a little bit of tail, and you know, maybe that floor tom might be ridden up a little bit during the verse. We'll see. And let's hear how it sounds in the mix.
Say what you're thinking, I'm not gonna follow. I'm not gonna follow. Take off, show me the stars. I'm ready to leave. I'm ready to leave.
Pretty cool.
The city, I'm flat broke. Show me the road to the good life.
So that's drums in a nutshell. I mean, if I'm gonna be thorough about it, let's just take a quick look here. I'm adding, not doing anything here really to the kick. Snare drum, probably adding a little bit of top, a little bit of upper mids, and a little bit of like 80 hertz. I'm adding a little bit of compression, and a little bit more EQ over here. And sucking out like a little bit of, 500 or so. And then backing it down with a trimmer. You know, the one thing, don't be scared to use more than one EQ. Don't be scared to use more than one compressor to get the sound that you want. You know, I usually have a few lined up and ready to go, and I usually EQ something a couple different times. If somebody comes in, if I get a session in and it has their EQ settings on top of it, typically what I'll do is rather than boosting their EQ settings more, I'll just open up another plugin behind it and EQ some more. And I'll do that for two reasons. If I get lost and I don't know, and I'm trying to get back to how it was given to me, it's much easier just to turn off one plugin than to go back and save copies and of the plugin settings and whatnot. So that's the drums in a nutshell.
So actually, before acoustic, we need to grab drum samples because we're going to use one of the drum mics for the acoustic.
Yep. So
basically, we're just gonna, just so we have them for safety and for layering, or if we got to fix anything, basically just hit soft, medium, loud of every drum.
Okay.
And then a few hi-hats, a couple crashes, a ride, and then the ride bell. And just make sure in between each one, you let the decay completely finish out.
yeah.
Okay.
So don't go fast.
All right.
So
Maybe
one,
on
but-
snare do 5 volumes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd like to get like 5 or so on the toms. as
Oh, okay.
well. Yeah, so I think there's definitely some intricate tom part, or just some quieter velocities that you're playing. So if we can get alternate versions of that would be great. So
So kick 3, cymbals 1, and toms and snare 5.
yeah, cool. And I'm gonna go ahead and hit record. And let's do snare drum. Go ahead. On this right here, you have the 2 mics that we use, which is it was the Lewitt Rec 640 mic, which has that dynamic element in it, and it also has the condenser element in it. So that's what these 2 tracks are here. These light blue tracks just kind of help me see. These are my sample tracks, so I know I just differentiate visually where my samples are. So I like to kind of treat the microphones and the sample all as one unit. I like to find a blend between the sounds, and then I like to send them to a bus and process them together as a whole. In my mind, that it just seems like you're combining all the elements to make it a more natural, cohesive element for the kit. So you'll see that I've routed these all through a bus. They come in on an aux track, and then that will end up feeding some of my subgroup masters. But I'll show you some of the processing that I did. If you look at the mics, you'll notice I don't have any plugins directly on the microphones. It's just a balance between the 2 mics. And here I'm featuring a little bit more of the condenser than the dynamic element of that microphone. I like the snap that I get from the condenser part of that particular microphone. So I'm featuring that a little bit more. And then the sample, I did do a little bit of EQing on it just to try and get it to sit in with this particular kick. This is the FabFilter Pro Q2. It's kind of my go-to utility EQ. It's such a great EQ. It's got such a large feature set, and it's a really versatile tool to help me EQ things the way that I hear them. But it's got the analyzers in it as well, so you can visually see what the spectrum, what you're looking at. So one of my favorite EQs. So I'm doing a little bit of processing here. This sample, and I'll play it for you, is it's got a nice bottom end to it and a good snap on up top, and blending that in with the actual kick mics I thought reinforced the low end a little bit more. So that's why I ended up using it. The low end was not quite as big as I wanted it to be, and this sample kind of helps me achieve that. So if I bring that in with the, maybe I'll play you the other mics first. You can hear kind of the difference between the 2 mics again. So the dynamic mic, or the dynamic element of that mic, condenser element of that mic, and then the sample. This has a little more solid part of the upper part of the low end, and I think I'm even reinforcing that. At right around 100 hertz, I'm boosting that quite a bit to just bring out that sort of chesty part of the kick. So all 3 of them together, you get that blend. But that sample also just reinforces that, like I said, that 100 hertz area, which kind of you feel it a little bit more in the chest, and I like that. But you still kind of have that natural sound with the bleed coming through with the mics, and to my ear, I felt like that was a good combination. So on the main aux track, I'm doing some compression, and I really started using the DBX 160. I'm familiar with the hardware units, and I've always loved them. The one thing that I really like about the plug-in is that it's got the mix knob on it now, which of course you didn't have that on the hardware units. So you always ended up having to do a parallel type situation. This allows you to do it right in the plug-in with the mix knob, and that's one of the greatest feature sets I think for compressors, is to have that wet dry or mix knob. So while I am kind of knocking off a lot here, up to maybe even 10 dB at some point, I am kind of doing a wet-dry mix, so roughly at maybe that's, no, it's 60, almost 60% basically. So that's the first thing, coming in, kind of compressing it, controlling it, trying to get a little bit of the punch emphasized there, and then an overall EQ process after the compressor. A little bit more in that. It's a little bit higher. It's 143, pushing that up a bit. During the tracking process, I feel like maybe I scooped it a little bit too much when we tracked it. So adding a little bit back of some of the stuff that I had taken out on the way in. I think your mindset when you're doing a tracking process versus a mix, it changes quite a bit. At least for me anyway. You try to get good raw sounds captured, but then your brain kind of shifts a bit when you go into a mix mode, and then you got to figure out how all those things are going to blend together. So sometimes on the spot when you're tracking, you get things sounding, and you get them sounding good, but you're still in a tracking mindset. You switch to a mix mindset, it changes a bit, and you find that, oh man, maybe I did pull out a little bit too much when I was recording that, but we can put some of that back, and that's what I ended up doing here. Also, the mid-range and the high end too. As you start blending, you start adding all your elements in. I feel like I was needing to hear more of that click on the kick, so I used once again the Pro Q2 to add some of those some of that mid-range, and then some of that snap up on the top, just a shelf that boosts some of that high frequency stuff up there. After that, I followed it up with the Sheps 1073, and it's got a sound to it that I like on the kick drum, and I'm boosting more 12K, a lot of high end boost to get it to come through on the mix, and even a little bit more of the mid range down here as well. And then it looks like an overall more broad stroke type EQ as a final, I guess, brush stroke, if you will, on the kick before I got it put in with the rest of the kit. One other element for the kick is this fader here, which is the sub kick, and that's that Yamaha NS10 speaker that we put on the outside of the kick drum, and that gives us a lot of the subs, a lot of the really low frequency information, and can kind of give you it's not like that chest feel, like that 100 hertz area. It's below that, and that woofer capturing all that low frequency energy is I think that's, for this particular thing, is really cool to have some of that blended back in. There's a little bit of like a sub pulse that happens. It's not like it's cranked in the mix. You can see I have it pretty low, but just tucked in there enough to kind of give you a almost more of a feel than you're actually hearing those subs. But I'll play it for you. Just a real low kind of pulse. A little bit of an 1176 kind of compression on it, and then filtering off just any of the high-end bleed that came through, any of that upper frequency stuff that we're not really concerned about, we don't want on that sub kick, so just a quick filter on that. And then I shaped it just a little bit just to help me control the bottom a bit, so it didn't get too out of control. And then also, one of my favorite things to do is to use a gate on things like this. On a kick drum like this, you can shape how quickly the decay is on a big subby type kick. I use it a lot on 808s. If I'm mixing something with an 808, I like to use a gate where I can control the closing to really shape how long that tail is. So that's really what that's for. It's not so much to gate out any noise, it's more to shape the end of the decay of the sub frequencies. So so that blended in with the other kicks, you get kind of a big natural kick sound. I'll mute the sub so you can hear it without the sub. And with it. I like that quite a bit. It's got all the attack, the punch, and then you've got some of that bottom end pulse that I like to feel in the mix. So that's kind of my approach for the kick drum. Next, I move on to the snare, and the concept with the snare is very similar to the kick. It's just a lot of blending between the actual mics and then the samples that I like to use. And of course, in this case, the samples are all samples from the actual kit that we use that day. So it's not a different snare drum recorded through a different preamp and a different mic in a different studio. It's the exact snare drum that we use that day with the equipment we use. And for me, that ends up really lending to a much more natural feel, but you've got a lot more control and flexibility when you use the samples that you make during the session. So once again, just a blend between the top snare mic and the bottom snare mic. You get quite a bit of bleed coming through on the mics, but you can take your samples and same thing, just a little bit of a blend between the top and the bottom mic for those samples. And I was hearing a little bit of a ringing thing in here that I didn't like at this frequency. That's all that is just dipping that out a bit. I can the one great thing about this EQ is you can solo in on frequencies that you hear specifically. So that kind of ugly thing happening there, I wanted to dip that out a little bit. And then for the rest of it is just kind of taking the combination of those, the actual mics, live mics versus the samples, and bussing them into an aux track as well, and processing them as a group once again. So to break that down for you, once again, this DBX 160 compressor with that mix knob, I just can't say enough great things about it. Love that thing. The Sheps 1073, adding a little bit of high end, but also kind of trying to get the sound of, you know, the 1073 itself on the snare drum. It's like a thickening type sound to my ear, just kind of gives it a little more meat and potatoes. Some EQ shaping as well. You can see I did a pretty aggressive shelf here just to boost up some of the lows, but it got a little bit too much. After doing a shelf all the way up here at 400, this area here, this 153, started to be a little too much to my ear, so I dipped that out a little bit. And then a little bit mid-range, a little 1K to help it sit. And then this, I'm not using a lot of times when I'm mixing all. It's a process of going back and forth as you're building the mix up. I start and I'll add some things at the moment where if I'm just started working on the drums but I haven't added any of the other elements, you get a sound that you like. Then you get further down the road and you start adding in some of the other elements, and you got to go back and refine some of the stuff that you've done. It's not just a straight linear process. It's always a method of going back and refining as you keep adding and building. You got to go back and recheck some of the stuff that you've done. So sometimes I have things like this in EQs where what's great about this, once again, is you can turn this band off, which you can see it's off right here. So at one point I must have been feeling like it was a little dark, and I was adding some 8K, but then as I got further into the mix and did some more processing, I decided I didn't need it. So it's a way of not killing the band altogether, but just sort of bypassing it.